Okay. Member for Fong Lim.
Nuisance drinking is a serious issue in the Territory, and everyone has testified to incidences of the extent to which it is a problem in the Territory. My colleagues from Fanny Bay and Drysdale and Karama and Blaine now have provided ample, sad testimony to the state of our polity. And it's impossible to ignore those stories. The challenge for us as legislators becomes to weigh those stories and that weight of evidence and that testimony against needs to protect civil liberties, to ensure that we empower our citizenry more generally, including our Indigenous citizenry. Now, I won't belabor the point in relation to specific instances of where these kind of issues are taking place, but I could not possibly ignore making mention of Bill Sullivan Park in Stuart Park, which really has been an unusable space for a ridiculous amount of time now because of problems associated with nuisance drinking. The fact of the matter is, in a place where social services were being provided with the best will in the world, we still had a space that was unusable for families, unusable for children, unusable as a recreational space for our broader citizenry, because police simply didn't have the powers to be able to police effectively in that area in relation to people who are intoxicated and causing a nuisance. That "and" is very important, and I'll come back to that in due course. I spent some of my campaign time in and around the Westralia Street shops and complex, and again, it gives me no joy to recount the anecdote that the very first time I stood in front of those shops to meet constituents, future constituents as it were, I was confronted with two people who were wildly intoxicated and causing a ruckus in that space, along that stretch. The violence spilled over into the Westralia Street shops and affected the custom and the workers of the Stuart Park corner shops. And I mention it only because I couldn't believe on my very first outing in the space that I had to be the one to call the police. And to the credit of the police, of course, they came as promptly as they were able to. But unfortunately, the response that I and other concerned citizenry got was that there's not much we can really do, because we don't have the powers vested in us at this point to be able to deal with intoxication and causing a nuisance under the same ambit. Now, what we are seeking to do here again is to provide a piece of legislation to support a suite of legislation that are, and I make no bones about this saying this either, tough on crime. They are tough on crime because we are in the middle of a crime crisis. We absolutely are in the middle of a social and economic crisis in the Northern Territory. It is why I'm in this chamber. It is why I believe all of us, in one form or another, are in this chamber. And unless we empower our police to be able to deal with these issues, then we can't possibly expect to be able to move forward on other issues. This new public drinking offence has been created to give police more powers, to fine, yes, to charge, yes, to arrest, yes, but people nuisance public drinking in restricted public areas. The member for Berkeley was very clear in his second reading speech about the scope of the legislation, and I think we are being unfair, quite honestly, in some regards, in conflating a range of issues associated with the Northern Territory more generally with the specific purpose and ambit of this legislation. This legislation, as per the second reading speech, is here to address and deter antisocial behaviour, as well as to create additional pathways for things like the banned drinker register. But notably in relation to what it does on section 17A, this is what I'm really interested in. It creates this new public drinking offence, such that we will now have an offence under the Liquor Act for drinking alcohol in a prohibited place if a person is also engaging in the act of causing a nuisance to other people within the vicinity of a public place. Now that's an important distinction, because what this isn't, contrary to some of the insinuations, is a piece of legislation targeting any one group of people. It's targeting people who cause a nuisance, no matter what their race or background. Now, the definition of a public place is clearly articulated. The specifics of the fine are clearly articulated. And in relation to urgency, it's also clearly articulated that this measure will commence immediately after the legislation is passed. So to the point that was made earlier on, how can this be an urgent matter? Well, it's an urgent matter. We expect it to take effect immediately, and we expect, as part of a suite of legislation, that will have an overall and cumulative deterrent effect. Specifics matter, and that's why it's important for us to understand here that what we're talking about is not the criminalisation of drinking. What we're talking about here is the criminalisation of nuisance whilst intoxicated. And I, for one, am starting to get tired with the lazy conflation of issues, the poor quality reliance on the data and the evidence without any actual data and evidence other than lazy offhand remarks in relation to, historic research that may or may not have relevance. I'm hopeful that we behave better in this place, but I'm also hopeful that we all start relying across the House on better information to make our decisions. So I challenge those across to provide the information on nuisance whilst intoxication that speaks to this matter, because I have taken some time to do the research, as I know have many of my colleagues, because I've shared it with them when we've had those discussions. The member for Mulka makes significant contributions to this House, and I respect the unique perspective from which he speaks from. He pointed straight away today to the suggestion that nuisance is ill-defined and that nuisance will be racially motivated or targeted and has no scope. I don't accept that. To my understanding, and I'm willing to be corrected, Section 747 of the Summary Offences Act 1923 is indicative of what defines nuisance, non-exhaustively. The conduct intended to be captured under this legislation is consistent with that type of behaviour. So it's not a case of us having not thought this out and thinking that any old thing can become a nuisance. That will be tested by the courts, but it will be mediated by our police, in whom we have faith and trust. We are taking a leap of faith to entrust our police force to make the subjective decisions to define what constitutes a nuisance, to restore public order at a time when there is clearly public disorder in innumerate electorates. We are negligent in doing nothing. Moving forward, we can only be guided by whatever data and evidence is at our disposal and that we can sensibly apply within the context of our polity. Now, the former government speaks of their exhaustive attempts to address liquor legislation and to address harm reduction. Again, it gives me no great pleasure to point to the controlled experiment that is the last 20 years of Labor governance here, which has resulted in us having the levels of domestic violence statistics that we have right now. You can draw a empiric, causal and correlative relationship between those factors. Now, on the research, there are a number of people who've done great research to document exactly what has happened over the years, and I note Sarah Clifford from the Menzies School of Health is somebody who has been very critical, in fact, of a lot of the legislation and the policy that has been enacted over a period of time, but forensically documented it. And I think it's incumbent on everyone in this House to be across this stuff rather than lazily referring to a bit of banned drinkers register, a bit of fetal alcohol syndrome, a bit of nuisance drinking, a bit of antisocial behaviour. Be specific. Tell me why this is a bad law with reference to nuisance in this context. Because in the absence of that, I am compelled by the information I'm provided by my colleagues and by the literature, which suggests that we don't have a controlled experiment here to determine whether or not there could be a deterrent effect by executing this suite of legislation collectively, which includes the connecting of nuisance and intoxication, which is not something that we've been dealing with here previously. The suite of reform, if you can call it that, legislated by Labor over the last 8 years specifically, has resulted in the suite of socioeconomic dysfunction that we are currently inheriting. That's the reality of it. Now, wide consultation has been taken in relation to this legislation, as with all of the acts that we are seeking to pass. And so it is unfair to suggest that there's been no community consultation, because I tell you what constitutes community consultation as well. Everyone is having pounded the pavement over the period that we have to hear from constituents who provide us real-world instances tied to a police report, tied to a geographic location, tied to a park. All of that constitutes testimony which has cumulative weight as well. And I say, as a, academic of sorts as well, that not all the answers can be found in the paperwork or the studies, but they can be indicative and provide instructive guidance. I note, for example, though, that the parliamentary librarian with the best will in the world provided us with references to research regarding the proximity of drinking establishments to, I think, fjords in Norway. Not super useful in this context. However, there is a range of other materials that have been provided to us collectively as a legislature, which everybody could have relied upon. I brought some of it in here today for people to just read casually in the lunch break if they'd like to be more informed on what people do have to say in the real world in relation to regulating alcohol. Or indeed, evidence-based policy in social science, or alcohol in relation to international evidence on the research and the public policy, or even our own national alcohol strategy. The reality of it is that lazy arguments are not winning me over, and what we have is a thought-out, considered package to try and deter and divert. We appreciate that that will necessarily result in some potential increase in detention, which is why we also have an extremely well-considered plan for corrections and correctional infrastructure. I think what I'm drawing at here is that it is extremely easy for everyone here to poke holes at problems. It is much more difficult to provide holistic solutions. The last government had 8 years to provide holistic solutions to a range of these issues, and sadly for Territorians, we're not able to get us any further than where we are right now, which by many measures and by many accounts is a worse place than we were in some 20 years ago as the Northern Territory. I don't want to conflate research that is not connected to the current debate either. But one of the interesting bits that I came across from Farmer, Miller and Taylor from 2024 is in relation to whether patron bans reduce crime, looking at assault offences in WA, before and after empowering the police with the possibility of imposing barring notices. Now, let's be clear, this is about an adjunct to this area piece of research in a different polity. But there is something instructive there because there is very limited data in this space about what can be done when we're connecting nuisance and intoxication. And we are working specifically in the public space, not in the private space. Notwithstanding, I quote from that paper that there are a number of implications arising from this study and some notable limitations have been acknowledged. Nevertheless, the association between the introduction of barring notices and a reduction in alcohol flagged violent offending appears to endorse the use of barring notices in WA. Show me the same legislation from 8 years, the same research from 8 years of Labor-controlled experiment that suggests all or any of what was passed in the last 8 years has had a discernibly positive effect on the socioeconomic prospects of anyone in the Northern Territory. I don't see it. Now, I'm extremely grateful for the handful of researchers who do turn their attention and their mind to examining what happens in this Northern Territory. But whilst we don't have a litany of subject-specific books and journals to rely on, empiric testimony on the ground is what we do have to work with. And if you can point to the stories, the testimony of the member for Fanny Bay or Drysdale or Karama or Blaine or anyone else being facetious, fictitious, fallacious, by all means do so. But we are not trading in hyperbole. We are not exaggerating the scale of the problem. We are drawing out the worst instances of problems that are endemic and problems that have spiralled out of control in this polity, and we all know that to be the case. There is a concerning trend here where the CLP is being charged with overlooking expert evidence, and that is simply not the case. I have drawn a small sample of materials here to simply make the point. But conflating expert testimony is likewise becoming commonplace in this place. When experts speak on a matter, we listen to them on that matter. But their testimony in respect of X is not always applicable in respect of Y. Nuisance and conflation with antisocial behaviour terminology is also a dangerous business, noting that antisocial behaviour orders and legislation to that effect and evaluation of the consequences of that kind of legislation have happened exhaustively across the world and notably in the United Kingdom under their ASBO experiment. Now, if you want a bit of light reading, ASBO Nation isn't a bad place to look for working out what works and what doesn't. And notably, that ASBO legislation at the end of it all, the UK legislation I'm referring to, was ultimately upscaled in the directions that we are taking to move things towards a more punitive system where we provide the police with the capacity to make more direct interventions. The suite of legislation that we are promoting has a cumulative goal of deterrence and diversion. The community consultation has not been zero, it has been exhaustive, and notably, it has drawn extensively on our police force who are advising us with modern testimony as to what it is they require to do their job to keep Territorians safer. The specific constituent cases matter and the specific locations testify to the weight of evidence we are providing. I therefore commend this bill to the House.
Very good. The Assembly stands suspended until 2 p.m.